So hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me into this space. I just have a little caveat that I have to share with all of you, and that is that I'm just a lawyer. I don't have a mental health background. I've never been I've never studied psychology. I knew I wanted to become a lawyer at 15, and that's exactly what I did. And partly I wanted to become a lawyer because I had a lot of trauma, like personal trauma in my life that came from growing up in a really violent home, going in and out of foster care, and then of course residential school, which I went to from 1985 to 1986. And so, when I looked at professions that didn't really have to require me to confront like human suffering, I thought law is perfect. A lot of my friends were becoming teachers and social workers and psychologists and all kinds of awesome helpers. And I was like, not for me, please. I just want to be cold and calculated and cutthroat. And I thought law is the place for me. And so everything I have learned about trauma, vicarious trauma, cultural humility, resilience, all of it I have really learned in the practice of law, in the courtroom, and then in hearing rooms, and just sitting with people who show up with a lot of trauma. And what I realized pretty early on in my career, maybe within the first few years, after having done a lot of harm, I'm sure, to a lot of people by insisting on this cutthroat, cold, calculated sort of approach, is that approach does a lot of harm to a lot of people. And so I really had to adapt and find a better way. And of course, in law school, they don't teach you, how to acknowledge people and how to meet them where they're at. So I had to really draw on the teachings of my great grandmother, who I was fortunate to have spent time with before she passed away when I was 17. And I would think back to how she taught me to sit with people who had a story to tell and who had pain to share. And I really pulled on that, and of course intuition, and I found a better way forward. And that better way I now call trauma-informed lawyering, or trauma-informed advocacy, or trauma-informed engagement. And so the respect goes to all the survivors I've worked with, and specifically all the Indigenous people that I've worked with. And so everything I share with you today has really come from them. So what does trauma-informed mean, and who is it for? I know that there's a lot of folks out there who say, oh yeah, I'm trauma-informed. I could check the box. Here we go. And I have an issue with that. I don't think that there's really an end goal. I think being trauma-informed means that it means that you've now began this lifelong learning process. Like you're in it, and you're in it for life. There is no endpoint. And we're going to talk a little bit about endpoints when I get to the piece about cultural humility. And in the context of someone who has had to be a decision maker, an impartial decision maker, someone who had to be relatively kind of removed from a situation, my role has never been to support people. It has never been to comfort people, and I don't promote doing advocacy that way, because if you are in an impartial position and you have to make a decision about someone's legal issue or other issue, then you have to ensure that you don't compromise your impartiality or your neutrality. And so there is a way to go forward and be trauma-informed with all the people that we work with. So this is not just for Indigenous people, it's for everybody. And it's also for you. You need to be trauma informed with yourself. And so everything I deliver to you all today is from that lens. So keep in mind, I'm a lawyer. I've had to be a decision maker, and I'm still at times a decision maker. I have to be impartial. I have to check my biases. And so I believe I can do all of that and still do no further harm to people. And I really think that that's what it's all about. Whoops. It's my granddaughter's birthday. She's 3 and she's calling. Sorry. So what is trauma? To people who are reliving a trauma, nothing makes sense. So they're trapped in a life or death situation, a state of paralyzing fear or blind rage. Mind and body are constantly aroused as if they're in imminent danger. They startle in response to slightest noises and are frustrated by small irritations. Their sleep is chronically triggered, etc. So, you know, there are a ton of different definitions for trauma, depending on where you look. And so I use this one, and I like this one because my friend Gabor Mate likes to refer to Bessel van der Kolk. If you listen to my podcast, you would have heard Harold Johnson also quoted him in his book, Peace and Good Order, The Case for Indigenous Justice in Canada. And Peter Levine, which was really my introduction to learning about trauma as a Crown prosecutor, has this book called Waking the Tiger. And they all refer to Bessel. And why is this definition awesome, and why is it the one I rely on and hold up? It's because this is exactly what I've seen. I've seen this in the courtroom lots of times. I've seen it in hearing rooms. I see it in interviews when I'm talking to people in the context of workplace investigations where people are you know, who are being investigated for bad workplace conduct, for people who have brought forward complaints of, you know, bad workplace conduct or professional conduct behaviors, and people who've witnessed it. So folks show up in all kinds of states. And most often I tend to find that folks will show up, they're either ready to rumble, their fists are up, they're ready to fight, or they're ready to run. So they're really, they're agitated, they're unsettled, hard to calm them down. But as I shared this particular definition with you, I want you to just think not in terms of people you've had to sit and make decisions about, but think of it also in the context of your peers, all the people at your level, people who have come in and out of your life professionally and personally, and think about it within the context of yourself as well. Because sometimes, and we're going to talk about vicarious trauma in a bit, but sometimes all of these presentations of trauma are symptoms that we can also absorb, and we can present with in the workplace and other places. And so, I mean, we only have an hour today. I think actually only 15 minutes, and 10 of that is questions. So I don't have a lot of time to get into it, but it's really important to be able to recognize trauma in all of its forms. So trauma and the brain. Keep in mind, I'm just a lawyer, but as I was like looking up trauma, wanting to understand it a little bit, I came across these sources that were talking about how trauma impacts the brain. So of course, it impacts the Broca's area of the brain, makes it difficult to talk about trauma. The hippocampus, of course, becomes smaller. That affects attention, learning, and memory. And you're probably thinking about so many people right now who have had trouble in this area. The two sides of the brain stop working in a coordinated way, which of course gives rise to confusion. Changes to the amygdala can cause people to experience emotional extremes. So like they're always amped up, right? And they cannot calm down. And that could be anything. That could be anger, that could be sadness, that could be anxiety. And then of course, reduced activity in the different parts of the cortex frontal lobes. So their survival response is triggered in the absence of danger. Why is it important? Because folks will run sometimes at the slightest thing. Remember earlier we talked about you know, people will startle at slight little things come up, and they will get startled, or they will get really frustrated. And if they're living in an extreme place, that just gets amped up by 100, and people will fight, or they will flee. I think that's something we often see. And before I get further into talking about trauma, I also have to say there are a lot of different forms of trauma. Like there are big T traumas, there are little t traumas. Big T trauma, of course, being like when someone dies, like a significant event, like a motor vehicle accident, like big life events. And little T traumas are like, you know, a pet dies, you're being bullied in the workplace. Right now, I think we're all kind of being traumatized in this time of like this pandemic that is forcing us into isolation, or, you know, a divorce, like whatever. And so what can happen when people are having these kind of trauma responses, and I think this is really important for all of us to recognize, is not all of us respond to trauma in the same way. Some of us could have a big T trauma and we show up and we're really like pretty stable, pretty chill, pretty, you know, almost detached. That may be because we've dealt with it, but that may more likely than not be because that's our coping mechanism, is to just kind of be very like very still, very static. And then you could have folks who've experienced a little T trauma, like a pet has died or their spouse left them or whatever it may be. And they may show up like almost inconsolable, like very deep in trauma. So why is this important to know? Because we shouldn't make assumptions when people have experienced traumas that they will have dealt with it or show up in a certain way. And so I think that's especially important right now, because I'm finding, at least, and I'm sure you are as well, this pandemic is having all kinds of impacts on people, and it's triggering all kinds of things and almost in its own way creating its own traumas. And so, I mean, one day is not necessarily like the next. Today was not like yesterday. We just, you know, and it doesn't help that the news is like fear mongering. I mean, I don't know why I listen to it, but it's terrible in that it just amps up the state of anxiety. And so we have to be mindful of that. And all of this goes towards being trauma informed, which I'm going to explain in a minute. But I think we have to talk about vicarious trauma. Normally I would talk like a whole bunch around this, but because we've only got a little time, I just want to quickly say, you know, those trauma symptoms that I talked about, we could take those on, particularly if we have all kinds of risk factors, which I'm going to talk about in a sec. But if we are also in jobs that put us on the front line of other people's traumas, we can start to take on those symptoms and exhibit those symptoms. So we will be the ones who will be losing sleep, who will be in this like hyper aroused or hyper vigilant state, who will be frustrated or lash out at minor irritations, etc. So vicarious trauma really is an occupational hazard. And if we are constantly on the front line and dealing with people who have a lot of suffering, a lot of traumas, and a lot of anxieties, what they are carrying is something that we could end up carrying as well, and unfortunately take it home with us. And so it's different from burnout. Burnout, of course, you can go on a vacation and you're good to go. Vicarious trauma really is being preoccupied with the experiences of other people. And I'm sure like educators feel this a lot. Like you see young people come in and out of these schools, or you hear your teachers talking about their experiences with young people. And there's a lot that they cannot do when they know that there is a lot that needs to be done for some people. And so sometimes we just think about all the ways in which people are exploited or marginalized or victimized. or abused, and we feel hopeless, we feel helpless, and then we just all of a sudden become immobilized. We can't work, we can't think, we can't, and then we start to move towards like coping mechanisms and unhealthy ones at that. So some people, if you drink wine at the end of the night, you might go from drinking one glass to a whole bottle. It could be anything. You're not sleeping, or you're sleeping all the time, or you're crying all the time, or you can't focus, or it takes you 6 hours to do a task that you can normally get done in an hour. You're having headaches, you feel sick to your stomach, you're having nightmares. It's so like the range is so, like the spectrum is so broad. And so it's really just an unhealthy preoccupation that is going to really get in your own way. And the issue with vicarious trauma, I have found, particularly as a lawyer, I work in a profession that really loves this workaholic, like work ethic. Like it's ridiculous, like go, 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 don't stop till you drop. And so I think when we all start working that way, like call it high performing, call it whatever you will, but when we start working that way and we don't take a second to allow ourselves to reflect on what we just experienced, what we just saw, what we just heard, and how it made us feel. And I think when we don't take a second to do these check-ins, at least I've heard from some psychologists who've been giving me therapy, they will say all of these things will store itself in your body. It doesn't go away. It wants to be acknowledged and released. And if you don't do it, it just finds a home inside of you somewhere. And so imagine these things, and then they stockpile, and then, right? It's going to blow up, and it never blows up in a good way. It will blow up like, a DUI or a gambling addiction or a suicide attempt or, deep depression or loss of marriage. Like, these are some of the impacts that vicarious trauma can have on folks when they, just keep pushing things down and they don't address what they're experiencing. So what are some risk factors? People who have a personal history of unhealed trauma, those who are repeatedly exposed to the traumas of others, and those who lack organizational support. So what do I mean by that? Organizational support, in my view, is not like an employee assistance program. Like, that's not organizational support. In my view, organizational support is when you work in an organization that actually says, yes, we are aware that there are psychological hazards associated with this job. We're going to make space for you to talk about trauma. We're going to look at resilience strategies that we can pull into our office and integrate into our processes and our policies, so that we can look at peer support options or other ways that we can mitigate against vicarious trauma impacting us, and how we can support each other, and how we can develop new practices that really give people a heads up about what it is they're getting into before they take on certain jobs. So there's so many different ways that we can create organizational support. If we don't, there's going to be a lot of effects. I talked about some of them, but others are, when you become really desensitized. Some effects, I would say, are also lateral violence in the workplace, where people are just kind of at each other, or just don't even acknowledge each other. You see each other, not even a hello. Being disassociative, having panic attacks, having a hard time really thinking through things. Remember that definition of trauma? We take all of that stuff on, all of the ways in which trauma can impact the brain. We start to have trouble learning. We start to have trouble with memory recall. We start to have trouble, putting things together in a coordinated way. And so there's a lot of negative effects of vicarious trauma. These are just some of them. But I mean, the risks or the harms really are quite significant. And I think it's very important at the outset that people find ways to support themselves and support each other, which includes like a self-care plan, a resilience strategy, and like a honest examination of what your policies and practices are. I just want to say one thing more about trauma, like big T, little t trauma. And that's the extent really of my expertise around trauma. Remember, I'm just a lawyer. I'm not a trauma researcher. I am not a therapist. I don't know. I can't tell you about all the complexities of all the different traumas, but I can tell you this. When I heard Gabor talk about, you know, trauma, like the big T traumas and the little t traumas, he talked about it in a way where I would say he was describing it as a grief blocker. And I'm such a visual person. So when I was hearing him talking, I was like, I totally see what he means. Okay, so when a trauma comes into your life, like a little t, big T, so your spouse leaves you, or you get into a big motor vehicle accident, or your parent dies, you know, you're kind of just going along, and then, you know, it, like all of your emotions just kind of spike. And then what happens? You're in this state of like intense emotion, whether it is fear or rage or sadness. And so when you get into that state, really trauma has itself just wrapped around you. It's got a hold on you. And grief is really the healer. Grief needs to now come in, pull the trauma off of you, heal you, and restore you to what you were so you could go back to this place. And so what trauma really is, you know, it's a grief blocker. It's kept grief at bay, kept it at the door, and refused to allow it to come in and do the healing work it needs to do. So you stay in that state of emotion, that high peak. I've seen people stay there for 20, 30, 60, 70 years, where they are always angry, always full of rage, always terrified, always sad. And that tells me they haven't done the healing work. And so why do I share this with you? Well, for a couple reasons. One is like to give you some awareness about how long trauma can stay with people when they haven't done the necessary healing to get past it. And two, to help you recognize that just because something happened 5 years ago or 10 years ago doesn't mean that person is okay now, like that they've gone past it. For all we know, trauma still has a hold on them, and grief hasn't come in to heal them yet. And so it's important that we understand that. And I always advocate for people to approach others as though we all have traumas, that everyone's traumatized. And so we need to be trauma informed and bring trauma informed approaches to everyone we talk to, everyone we work with. It's a challenge, I know, because I mean, I'm not naturally patient and empathetic and all those things that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But if I, you know, if I can be cold and cutthroat and calculated and have to learn empathy and patience and all of those things that make you trauma informed, if I could do it, so can you. I wanted to just include this slide for people who are thinking about how you can integrate some kind of resilience strategies within your organization. And so I'm not going to go through it because we don't have enough time, but this whole slide deck is going to all of y'all so you can take a look at it. Before we talk about exactly what being trauma informed is, I think we need to talk about the ways in which we build barriers. So everything I'm sharing with all of you today, I want you to think about all of this content in relation to you. This is not really right now. It's not about it's not about your staff. It's not about students. It's not about your boss. It's about you. What is your relationship to trauma? What is your relationship to control? What is your relationship to certain biases? Like, it's really about you. So there are all kinds of ways in which we build barriers, like stacking blocks we put between ourselves and other people. And I've had the privilege of working all over this country and seeing lawyers in all kinds of capacities. And not to say lawyers and teachers are the same, but I'm sure there's some similarities. So some of what I've seen is, as a barrier, is folks who are unwilling to meet people where they are. So you see that somebody is distressed, you see someone is hurting, you see someone is angry or upset. And instead of meeting them where they are and being able to make space for all of whatever's presenting, because it's not about you, it's just their trauma presenting. Instead of making space for that so you can do the work you need to do with them, you just shut that down and you say, we need to, talk about this. Or you just shut them completely down and say, you know what, we're going to reschedule this meeting and come back another day. So not being willing to meet people where they are. No self-awareness. Like, how do I show up? How am I showing up in this situation? It doesn't just mean, am I willing to drive to Burnaby to meet with someone? It's not about geography. It's about, what tone do I bring into the room? What does the way I carry my body say about whether or not I'm judgmental of this person? What language do I use? How do I make space for folks? So like one example I'll give is, I was sort of taught to, that it's important to establish yourself as an authority in the room. So you go in, you often sit at the head of the table, you dictate sort of how the meeting is going to go, etc. And I really had to abandon that and find a different way forward. So what I ended up developing, because all these things like build barriers, and it's really like, what is it? Like 90% of our communication is nonverbal. What you're really saying to people is, I'm the authority, I'm superior, I'm the important one, I'm here to help you. No one wants to sit with anyone like that. So, and no one wants to open up to anyone like that. So I would walk into a room and I would say, where would you like me to sit? Do you want the lights up? Do you want them down? How are the lights for you? Do you want me to leave the door open? Do you want me to close the door? Like, in all of these ways, you're sort of relinquishing control and allowing people to take up more space and allow them to have space. And I think that's really important, to be self-aware in these ways and to let go of control and allow for some flexibility and show vulnerability. There's no problem. And I mean, I know that's a tough one, but like, there's no problem, even as an impartial decision maker, to show vulnerability, to go, I know this is stressful. It's stressful for all of us. You're not compromising yourself just by acknowledging that we're all human beings. Being impatient, uncomfortable with silence. I find if you're working with someone who in a very difficult and emotional and maybe traumatizing situation, if you're asking them for something that's taking them back to that moment, give them 5 or 10 minutes to give the information to you that you need, or to engage with you in the process that's going on between the two of you. Because if you don't, and you shut people down, or you go, you know what, because you're thinking, oh, this is taking too long, I'm really uncomfortable with the silence, let me just circle back. Let me just circle back, or let me just give you a break. What you're really kind of doing is saying, I'm not here for that. And this is making me really uncomfortable. So let's just not do this. And really, it's not about us, right? Like, these processes that we have to pull people into, they don't want to be there. More often than not, they don't want to be engaged in these conversations that may be triggering or traumatizing, or making them feel quite out of control. And so we have to recognize that when we're dealing with people. So how can we be as disarming as possible? These are questions like you need to ask yourself, and become comfortable with silence. If it's going to take someone 5 or 10 minutes to talk to you, then just sit there and write it out, because what you're saying is, I'm here for the whole thing, whether it's being silent or being someone being angry or somebody crying. Like, just be present for it. It's important to witness. It's important to witness people's trauma, allow them to present their traumas, acknowledge it, and then move past it. This is how we build relationships, in terms of removing all of these barriers and recognizing that you've got to meet people where they are, even if it makes you really uncomfortable. And I used to talk about this all the time, because, like, I remember, so earlier I said why I went to law school. I want to be cold and calculating and cutthroat. I was so uncomfortable with human emotion. Why? Because I wasn't even tapped into my own. And when I would hear people, when I would hear folks talk about, you know, things that were deep and real, it would freak me out, and I didn't like it, because then I'd have to think about what was deep and real for me, and I was so disconnected from myself. And so if people would start to cry, I'd be the first to leave the room. If somebody would get mad, I'd be the first to leave the room. I would just walk away all the time on people in very vulnerable, you know, presenting in really vulnerable ways. And you know, I recognize in being that way, I was doing folks a lot of harm. So I had to find a way, even though I'm still uncomfortable with those emotions still today, I had to adapt and find a way to just become comfortable with the uncomfortability of human emotion, or whatever it is that someone is displaying. And of course, your own trauma and vicarious trauma, that's going to trip you up. And we're going to talk about that as well. So 2 common approaches to leadership. Remember earlier I talked about how I wanted to be the calculated one, which is why I became a lawyer. I realized that being a transactional lawyer is something that does a lot of harm to people. You refuse to see the human being sitting in front of you. You are impatient, rigid, closed off, calculated, disconnected, tight-lipped, and so rigid. I mean, like, everything about any process that people had to work with me in, I had to follow a script, and I had to be out the door in a certain amount of time. I needed information, but I needed it in 40 minutes, right? And so sometimes when folks are deep in trauma, they can't give you that information in 40 minutes. And if you make them give it to you, it may be incomplete, or you'll have done quite a bit of harm in the process. And so I really had to adapt and learn to become relational. I mean, these things, like, ask my grown children, being empathetic and patient and responsive doesn't necessarily come natural to me still, but I work on it. I learn it, I work on it, because I know that in order to do no further harm to people, this is the kind of investigator, decision maker, lawyer, litigator, advocate I have to be. I have to see the whole person. And even if I have to have conversations about something that is not relevant to my job, I will have that conversation if it means that's what they need to feel safe in my company. If that's what they need to trust me, I will be there for the whole thing, because if I need information from them, I need them to open up, I need them to trust me, then I have to be there for the whole thing. I have to show empathy. I have to be patient. I have to be responsive as opposed to reactive, and transparent. This is the process. This is its limitations. This is what's going to happen with your information. So triggers and tensions. How do you respond to strong emotions? That's a question you should all ask yourselves. How flexible are you with time and control over space and process? Are you like many lawyers and a bit of a slave to the clock? Why? Maybe we need to change that. Do you adapt your tone and your body language? Like, are you self-aware about how you show up? I used to always like cross my arms all the time because I was just, I don't know, born that way. But I had to learn to drop my arms and be open, which is not natural for me. And so there are all these ways we have to really, really inquire with ourselves how we present, and whether how we're presenting is the result of our own triggers. Are we being triggered by something right now? Do we not like someone? Do we not like the situation? Is the matter that we have to deal with connected to something, a personal experience we've had, etc. So you have to think about the things that trigger you. And our triggers are all different and they come at random times. And so we need to be alive to what our triggers are, because if we're not alive to it and we suppress a whole bunch of stuff, it's going to give rise to tension. And we're going to show up in reactive ways, and we're going to be tight-lipped, and we're going to move towards being more transactional than we are relational. And in that approach, we're going to do a lot of harm. So the trauma-informed framework really is, you can identify trauma, the little traumas, the big traumas, vicarious trauma. You can adjust your approach. You have self-awareness. Okay, how do I show up? How do people perceive me? What do I need to be? How can I be disarming in this meeting? What can I do to let go of control? You adapt your strategy. So you prioritize safety and empowerment. So that means you look at the process that you're about to go through with someone and you figure out, what do you need? What do you need to feel safe? And maybe people don't even know, like if they're highly triggered and highly traumatized, they don't even have self-awareness. So you need to be more in tune to, what would the reasonable person need going through this process? Do they need additional supports? Would they, and who would those support people be, or support services be? What do they, how can we help them as they go through these processes? And you always want to have, we don't have enough time today, but you want to have like these very specific conversations around how you empower people. Like, there's questions you can ask people to bring them into the process, so it almost becomes a partnership or a collaborative effort, because nobody ever wants to be the problem that has to be solved. Most people, in my experience, want to be part of the solution. They want to have a hand in getting to the end point, whatever that is. And then at all times, you safeguard your mental health. Boundaries. We all should have them. We should all know exactly what they are. What is our like no-go zone? And it's different for different people. I can't tell you what your boundaries should be, because mine are very specific, and yours are very specific, and I'm sure they don't necessarily align, at least not completely. Okay, cultural humility model. Snoopy, I just had to like share some Snoopy thing. You can take a look at it later, but it's really like the process of really asking yourself, has it ever occurred to you that you might be wrong? Cultural humility and cultural competence, they're very distinct. So cultural competence, of course, addresses the ability to effectively work with others and positions you as the expert. Oh, good. I'm glad you like it, Jacqueline. It positions you as the expert of someone else's culture. And I think I would even take that a step further. And like some people feel almost like they're an expert in someone else's lived experience. And I think right now in respect of like, say, sex assault victims, like if we've worked with a lot of them, or we were one, we're like, oh yeah, I know everything there is to know. No, we don't. We cannot ever put ourselves in a position, we should not, that we know everything there is to know, because if you think that way, then you're not going to learn anything else, and you're probably going to do a lot of harm, because at some point your information education is going to become outdated. So cultural humility really is an ongoing critical self-reflection process, recognizing that the person in front of you is the expert and not the textbook, and that you will always be the learner. And so imagine for a moment, like, I do not think that, ego and humility can exist in the same room at the same time. So when you walk into a room, who is leading you? Is it ego or is it humility? or is it empathy? Like, who's in the driver's seat when you show up? You don't have to tell me, but just ask yourself that question. Practicing cultural humility. So you accept that the process is lifelong. It's lifelong learning. There is no endpoint. You don't get a certificate. I am now officially culturally humble. You have to confront your biases. We all have them. I hate it when people say, I don't have biases. Yeah, you do. We all do. In confronting your biases, then you can take steps to figure out safeguards. Okay, how do I safeguard my decision-making process or my engagement process or my questions from my bias? I think it's important. I know I have a very specific bias, and when I have to work on a file and that bias is triggered, I call on an associate to say, okay, I have one of those files. I have to be really careful. Here are my questions. Here is my process. Here's my decision. And she double checks everything, and she calls me on my BS. You have to really examine what you think you know and what your source of knowledge is. You have to ask a lot of open-ended questions. This requires, folks, courage, vulnerability, and openness. I know that ain't easy, but it really is what is needed. Capacity for empathy and perspective taking. Being an active and mindful listener. Quickly, we're going to get into the piece about Indigenous people, because I'm an Indigenous woman and I can't talk about cultural humility and trauma-informed practice without talking about Indigenous people. So I think what's important to say is we've all experienced trauma, some direct and some intergenerational. We carry the traumas of our parents and our grandparents. That's a known fact. And so remember that when we are dealing with people. And I want to share this video with you, and I tried to play it earlier and it worked, and hopefully it works now. If it doesn't, somebody will hit me up in the chat and say, I can't hear it, but you should be able to hear it.
The Government of Canada sincerely apologizes and asks the forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly.
All is not forgotten, and someone is forgiven. Words to say to soften up the hardness that I'm living in. I hate to say indifference is becoming my religion, but I haven't learned to pray in ways to satisfy tradition. When I think about identity, I think about my language, how my folks were taught it would be to my advantage. To learn a foreign tongue, they could not foresee the damage. Damn shame when it happens, you don't see it till it passes. So where's all the support for Anishinaabe Mo in classes? Assimilation tactics left no room for us to practice, and I really wish I could adjust. Yeah, I really wish I could have just listen with my heart and not my ego. I was fragile, conditioned by the world to think my culture wasn't passed down, but I learned the generosity. It's in my genealogy, so fuck all the bureaucracy and keep all your apologies. I know you're sorry, but you're more lost than me. Your land's across the ocean and I'm right where I should be. And I reckon this damnation will force reconciliation down the throats of our survivors and the people it's displacing. I know you're sorry, and now you call on me to fix the
Oh no.
broken hearts created by your policies. And these are the things that I think I know. I am but a leaf on a tree that grows its roots in the ground like a seed that's sown in the dirt of the earth. Is where I was born. It's where I will return when this journey ends and I've earned what I've learned. So tell me to get over it. I'm so fucking over it. Steal everything in sight and teach me about private ownership. Bleach everything you like and teach me about pride of ownership. Bleach my inherent rights and tell me that I never owned this shit. As generations pass, you'll act as if you never noticed it. While as kids committing suicide as a way out of the hopelessness, I know you're sorry. You say you're not to blame. Fill your heart to brim with guilt, but not an ounce of shame. Break branches off of family trees and tell us times have changed, but the focus of this genocide at root remains intact. So instead of killing Indian kids, why don't we kill this Indian act?
Okay, that rap constantly gives me goosebumps. Okay, what did I do now? Let me see. Okay. I'm going to talk now about really quickly, because I know we only have about 5 minutes before we get into some Q&A. So he talked about the Indian Act, right? He talked about a lot of things, actually. You know, reconciliation fatigue is the whole thing I could get into, but you know, the Indian Act came into effect in 1876, and out of that came mandatory Indian residential schools. The Indian Act is still in effect. It still rules my life as a status Indian and many others. So residential schools came out of this Indian Act. It was intended to kill the Indian and the child, as most of you know. The last residential school closed in my home province of Saskatchewan in 1996. The one I attended closed, I think, in 1994. And so what has happened out of that, I would say, I could tell you from my own lived experience, having gone to residential school, my brother having gone for 7 years, and having sat with hundreds of survivors as an Indian residential school adjudicator who had to take them back to these horrific abuses, that those schools really taught Indigenous kids to hate themselves and hate each other. And I say it kind of quickly because if I have to sit with it, it's just going to get ugly. I'll get really emotional. And I think it was really effective because we see a lot of trauma that continues to resonate and permeate in our communities. And I'm sure you've seen them as well. And so some of the ways in which it shows up is you know, the child welfare system, inability to parent, the educational system, inability to problem solve, inability to cope with emotional and mental disturbances, have healthy relationships, make good decisions, the criminal justice system. Yeah, part of the criminal justice system for sure is because, you know, part of it, I think, is some of us have become quite institutionalized. I would say that's definitely true for my brother, who's been in and out of prison his adult life. I think part of it is absolutely systemic discrimination. And I mean, you know, and a lot of it is just people don't know where they belong. Like they've been disconnected from their communities and their families, and they lost a sense of belonging. And so where we see some of these like intimate partner violence, these trends, I would say I invite you to always go back and think about the harm that residential schools has done. And so I think it was, I hate to say the word effective, but it really was in terms of breaking our spirits. But fortunately, many of our communities and our nations are coming back, and we're really tapping into our resilience and finding a new way forward, and trying to repair all that was broken. And definitely, we got a long way to go. I'm going to skip through this because we're running out of time. So trauma-informed, let me see, trauma-informed, I think I skipped past something. I want to just say reconciliation efforts feel like tokenism, triggering and trauma. This is really important because I just want to share with you, I mean, this is not the case here for me today, but when you invite Indigenous people in to teach you something around like what can we do to reconcile, what has the lived experience been, or what was like, how did history impact you? It's important to acknowledge that for many of us, this is not history. I mean, residential schools for me are not history. I went to residential school. I've lost a lot because of residential school. And so we have to make space, I think, for healing. We have to make space for hard conversations. We have to make space for confronting truth. And what does that mean? I think these are questions that we have to put to the Indigenous people that we invite into our spaces, because if we don't, when we pull Indigenous people into our spaces, whether as employees or as educators to teach us something around reconciliation, it can feel a lot like tokenism, and it could trigger all kinds of trauma. And it's important, I think, that we have to change the spaces that we create to reflect Indigenous lived experiences. It's not enough to bring people in and absorb them, because that's assimilation. We actually want to change our spaces. So remember, tapping into cultural humility. How can we start to reflect the people who live here, the people who exist here? And so I think that that's key. So what does trauma-informed leadership and cultural humility ultimately creates change? It creates change within an organization. offers opportunity for peer support, promotes collaborative engagement. Most people want to be collaborative. It improves relational skill building, which is really important because that is the core of connecting with people and doing no further harm. It builds trust and transparency, which a lot of people need to feel safe. And it ultimately is going to allow people to feel safe and empowered and part of the system that they are, that they are associated with, that they are representing, as opposed to being like on the outside looking in. And so that is the last of my slides. I really thank you for listening to me. It was really hard to like try to capture all these key concepts in 15 minutes because normally I do like at least 2 hours. So I appreciate you all listening to me. And if I jumped over some really important stuff, I'm really sorry. But if anyone has questions, comments, reflections.
Thank you so much, Myrna. And I know that you had so much to share and not to be able to do that in a short amount of time we're together. So it feels to me like we have to have you back, like for a part 2.
Man, I feel totally like I was fumbling. I'm so much better and I'm so much more eloquent. I don't know what it is. Educators make me nervous. I will say that first and foremost. And secondly, talking about trauma is, today it's tough because I just learned I can't go home to Saskatchewan to see my grandkids. So I'm feeling kind of crappy because of this whole COVID thing. But also, I just want to say, if you really truly are committed and looking at ways to be trauma informed, all you have to do is lead with safety and empowerment. Like, how can you be a safe and empowering place for anyone you're working with? That's all you have to ask yourself. And the answers will come. And then people will come to you and they will feel safe with you. And they will know that you hear them and you see them. And even if it's uncomfortable for you, you're going to go work that out on your own and you're not going to put it back on them. And that's really what it comes down to.
Thank you. So we do have a few minutes for a couple of questions. And so one of the questions that came up to the questions box was you talked about the importance of grief. And the question is, what strategies do you recommend just to allow that process to take place? I think many of us, I think that speaks to the vulnerability aspect as well, and people just sort of unwilling to grieve when they're dealing particularly with those issues around vicarious trauma.
Yeah, so I have all these strategies, that people could do on their own or they could do them with others. But there was an elder so I failed law school, like my first year of law school in 1998, I failed. I don't mind. I spent that whole year with Vince Stogan and his family on Musqueam. And he taught me a lot. And one of the things that he taught me was about trauma. He said, trauma and grief, like trauma is something that sticks to you. Remember, grief is a healer, right? So trauma will stick to you and it'll keep you in a place of like deep pain, deep fear, deep rage, whatever it is, right? And so how do you get that off of you? One of the ways he said is like whenever you can, go out in nature, put your hands in a river and allow the water to heal you, because it's a healer. It's grief presenting to take the trauma off of you and to start putting you into that place to restore you to what you once were before the thing happened. And he said, where you don't have access to water, like a natural water source, like a river, or a creek, or a stream, then you just go after a heavy meeting or a heavy thing in your life, go and have a shower. Go put your hands in cold water in the sink in the bathroom, and just allow it to pull all of that pain off of you, and let the healing come. Water is a healer, and I would say so are the trees, and so is nature. Not a trauma researcher. I don't know. PTSD is a very specific thing, and then there's now complex PTSD, and then there's, I guess personalized trauma. I don't know. You're going to have to ask a trauma expert, but I just think right now we're all living in a heightened state of either being triggered or traumatized, like little t trauma, and we're all kind of in a heightened place of being. So if we've got stuff in our histories, it's going to be amped up. So what I can say to you is, like, take care of yourself. Find ways, like, create a self-care plan for yourself, whatever it is. You do yoga, you take a bath, you talk to a friend, you say a prayer, you meditate, you practice mindfulness, you do debriefing with a coworker, you do a Zoom debrief. Ask for consent first, because some of us are at capacity. We can't hear anyone else's pain right now and anxiety. So ask for consent, and then make the rules really, really clear, and then do a debriefing. But there are all these ways that we can take care of ourselves and each other in the workplace, and we have to find a way. We have to build a resilient strategy. That's what it is, because we have to rise from this. Not to channel Brené Brown or anything, but I think we all need to practice. We all need to be vulnerable. I think especially right now, there's a lot of vulnerability presenting, and we need to meet people where they are. So if folks show up and they're vulnerable, then you need to show some vulnerability, right? And so I don't know about teachers, but I know in my profession, man, vulnerability is like, it's like the F word. No one wants to know, and so, but we need it. We need to bring humanity into our profession, and that means that we let people actually see us. And if we like, what I know about working with people who show up with a lot of trauma is they want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to be validated. So you could say, I see that you're upset. Of course you're, I could see, that this thing is affecting you. Of course you're frustrated. Of course you're angry. Of course you're scared. People just want to be seen and heard. And I think that's also true for all of us. We want to be seen and we want to be heard. And if, I don't know about you, you out in this webinar world, but like when you're always the type A or the one in control or the one who people go to for solutions and problem solving, like I'm that person, it's hard to find space where you could also just be vulnerable. And so I think we have to model it for each other and remind people that we can be strong and we can have like all of the solutions, but we can also be vulnerable and experience pain, and we can cry or we could be afraid, and that's totally okay. The trauma-informed lawyer, it's not just for lawyers, it's for everybody. So listen to it, like seriously. I think there's something in there for even all of you. And yes, Kelvin, you're talking about trauma-sensitive, trauma-aware. I'm with you. There is no end point here.
Yeah.
Thank you all for listening to me. Thank you.